Chapter 5, First Part. Though the crisis had passed, the town showed signs that it hadn't yet recovered from the tragedy. The owners of devastated houses didn't look very motivated to repair the damage as they sat around sulking, and their neighbors didn't seem at all inclined to help cheer them up. Every face wore a demented expression, and the people stood around like empty husks, or milled about in the streets aimlessly. It was almost as if the overwhelming disaster had stripped everything that mattered from them. But in the midst of the milling townsfolk, mixed with the chatter of the frantically scrambling relief party that answered directly to the mayor, a crisp and spirited young voice rang out. It was that of Dr. Tsurugi, working at the emergency medical facility that had been established in front of the hospital. "Okay," he said. "I want you to form a single file. No pushing. And one by one, take a seat." Once a patient was seated in the simple revolving chair, Dr. Tsurugi ran his hands over their clothed form and asked them a few questions. The palms of his gloves were imprinted with some kind of medical diagnostic program. The questions were to gauge the level of mental upheaval each patient had suffered. "Okay. Point 97. A slight case of radiation poisoning. Mental balance is... no problem. Pick your medicine up over there. Okay, next." Only at the very end did a bit of honest emotion slip into the doctor's face, but shortly thereafter he reclaimed his beaming countenance. It was a sight to see him in action, working through the endless chain of patients at a rate of less than a minute each. However, the person by his side dispensing medicine wasn't the nurse. It was a lovely young lady of 17 who couldn't compliment anyone or say a single word to comfort them, but who showed all the compassion she could muster in her large eyes as she quietly handed them their medicine. It wasn't difficult to believe that, less than 10 hours earlier, her whole body had been covered with plasters for removing radioactive contamination. It was Lori. After seeing how terribly overburdened Dr. Tsurugi was, she'd volunteered to help out. Of course, the physician's situation hadn't been helped by the fact that his nurse had been horribly frightened and had yet to recover from her dementia. As Lori gazed at the townsfolk, and the numb expressions they wore, there was sorrow in her eyes. But another, more invigorating feeling filled her slight frame. She'd lost the use of her voice and ears, but she had to go on living. The determination to do so burned strongly in her. However, on a more basic level, the girl was immensely pleased to be able to do something on her own. Lori's smiling eyes were suddenly infused with an intense glimmer. A powerful figure in black was coming down the same street filled by the lines of townsfolk. T stopped next to the physician. "Make it through okay?" he asked. From the hunter's tone of voice, it wasn't clear whether he was actually concerned or just being polite. And, of course, the sound of it didn't reach Lori's ears at all. Still, she got the feeling there was something beyond the usual severity in the gaze he cast on the physician and herself, and it made her heart leap. "I muddled through somehow," Dr. Tsurugi replied. "How about you? I've heard Dhampirs have a far greater tolerance for radiation than the average human." The physician caught himself and quickly bit his lip. A few of the townspeople looked surprised by what they'd heard, but most showed no reaction at all. While the shock of the magnetic storm was to blame, the effect that it had on the populace was just too great. Is the corpse inside? The hunter asked. Yes, he's still asleep. I don't know what you did to him, but it must have been incredible. I'd like a look at it. Fine. But I'd like something in return, the physician said, his hands never taking a break from examining patients. What's that? Once you're done with that, I'd like you to help me out. There's nothing I could do, said Dee. If you've got arms and legs, we've got work for you. Okay, if I've got time. And with that uncharacteristic reply, Dee went through the door. Laurie's sorrowful gaze followed the hunter. He hadn't so much as acknowledged her presence. Page break indicated by a small cross. On entering the operating room, Dee took a portable atomic lamp off the shelf and switched it on. A pale flame blazed up around the wick. The body of the man lying on the operating table on the other side of the room was outlined in blue. Twisting the faucet to get the water running, Dee looked down at his left hand and said, I've got some soil ready too. But what would you like first? Don't ask dumb questions, a voice quickly answered. At the same time, a human face complete with eyes and a nose mysteriously surfaced in the palm of the hunter's hand. Forming a scowl, it said, You're splitting hairs with all this talk about fire first or water first, when the truth is, nothing's been all that tasty lately. After all, I'm the one who's got to eat them. Oh, my. We've got a nuclear reactor today? That looks positively delicious. None of that alcohol lamp or dried werewolf dung, thank you. That stuff's the worst. Taking a handful of dirt from one of his coat's inner pockets, Dee put it beside the lamp. Be quick about it, he said. The corpse should be waking up soon. Huh. Well, if it does, you can just put it back to sleep again. Day in and day out, you're always pushing me around. Fire or water? The hunter asked. I'll take the dirt. Dee held his left hand over the blackish pile. There was the intense squeal of air being drawn in, and the clod of earth broke apart into a powder that was inhaled by the palm hanging over it. That tastes awful, the voice said after sucking up every last grain of dirt. This soil hasn't known the usual ups and downs, or been part of the natural circle of life, death, and rebirth. It doesn't take its life from the planet. It's just a decoration laid down over steel. You're not going to be very satisfied with the kind of results you get by feeding me crap like this. Without saying a word, Dee held his left hand up to the atomic flames. Sheesh, you dolt. Water's supposed to be next. The voice squawked, but the hunter didn't move a muscle. Further curses of freak and sadist soon died out, and the atomic light, as impossible as it sounds, quickly condensed into a single glowing stream that disappeared into Dee's hand. Or, to be more precise, into the tiny mouth that had opened in the palm of his hand. And just how voracious was that mouth? Well, the ultra-compact reactor the lamp was equipped with was supposed to be enough to power the atomic flame for more than a decade. But in less than 2 minutes, its color faded, it flickered, and finally it went out. Dee didn't so much as raise an eyebrow at that bizarre occurrence, but instead put his hand under the spigot in the sink, palm up now. A few minutes later, the voice sputtered, That's enough! And as it did, Dee twisted the faucet to shut it off. How are you feeling? Dee asked. His eyes remained trained on the corpse. Well, I'll get by. I suppose I'm a hell of a lot better than I was last night. Along with the words, A gout of flame roared from the palm of the hunter's hand. In a mouth left pale blue by a few thousand degrees of heat, a red tongue flicked impassively, saying sharply, "So, what the heck do you want analyzed?" Devoid of pity or any other deeper emotion, D brought his left hand over to the man on the operating table and put it against his forehead. At that instant, the whole corpse stiffened and bent backward from the waist, like a bow. It snapped into the shape so fiercely that it wouldn't have been strange to hear his hip bone shattering. Countless red points began to form all over his body, along with specks of blood. Had this body, which had supposedly long since ceased to function, begun to have metabolic activity once again? The vivid red spots grew larger and larger, and in no time their surface tension broke, and they began to course down the sides of the body, leaving disturbing trails on his flesh. When the first drop hit the operating table, a faint moan escaped from the corpse. D had his eyes half closed. What was his hand trying to do? What kind of analysis? What did he hope to learn from this corpse? Page break indicated by a small cross. When the treatment of the townsfolk and the distribution of medicine had finally wound down, Laurie quickly looked at the physician. Massaging his hands, Dr. Srugi nodded to her. The girl got up and went into the hospital. Taking pains not to tread too loudly, she peeked into the waiting room. There was nobody there. Was he in the office? Or maybe the operating room? It had never even occurred to Laurie that Dee's business there might be with a corpse. Once more, she stepped out into the hall. She decided to try the office. A few inches away from her, the door to the operating room opened inward. A figure suddenly appeared. A man, completely covered in blood. Laurie froze in her tracks, choking back a scream. The man suddenly collapsed in a heap. When Laurie saw the other figure that stood behind him, she desperately tried to keep her knees from failing her. She didn't want him to see her do anything stupid. Having lost her voice and hearing, she was damned if she'd lose anything else now. As the girl tried desperately to steady her footing, Dee watched her without saying a word. Waiting until she'd gotten her trembling under control, the hunter grabbed the corpse by the neck and brought it back into the operating room. As they gazed at the blood spilled on the floor, his eyes held a dark tint. And by the time Dee went back out into the hall, Laurie had returned to her senses. She'd always been a brave girl. "You want something from me?" Dee asked. He said it out loud. Laurie tried desperately to follow the movements of his lips. Somehow, she managed to read them. She shook her head. She had no business with him. She just thought it would be nice to see him. That was all. While you may not be able to get back what you lost, you can learn something new in return, Dee remarked impassively, almost as if he didn't care what became of Laurie. Not understanding exactly what had been said to her, Laurie pursed her lips with grim resolve and tried not to miss anything else. Dee said to her, "Come with me. We probably don't have much time." And with that he walked out. Laurie followed after him. A smile had risen to her lips. By watching Dee's cold profile, she understood what he was saying. "Just where are you two going?" The physician called to them as they came out the front door. "Where's the highest point in town?" the hunter asked in return. "That'd be the hill behind the factories." "Why?" Nodding with satisfaction, Dee began to walk away. As the two figures walked off down the street, the physician watched them coolly. Page break indicated by a small cross. The damage to Chad Beckley's hose had been relatively minor. Fastening a waterproof tarp over a couple of holes that falling rocks had left in the roof, he decided the repairs could wait for another day. They were a family of 4. And there was Chad, his wife, Thera, and their 2 sons, Luke and Simon. Chad's family was extremely concerned about the way he was acting. Ever since he'd come home from the navigational control room, his expression had been one of deep depression. Skipping dinner entirely, as soon as he'd put the sheet over the roof, he'd gone straight to bed. Most troubling Chad was where the town was headed. The new route that had been programmed in the computers clearly had them headed right for some of the nobility's ruins. They'd probably be there in less than 2 days. The question was, what was waiting for them there? Even the mayor said he didn't know. Legend alone had the answer. Graves. And not the kind of noble resting place ornamented with elaborate crests and guarded by electronic devices. What slumbered there was. Hauling his mind back from its slide into anxiety, Chad tried his best to get to sleep. The wind howled outside his window. Tomorrow, he'd have to get up before dawn and head back to the control room. What on earth was going to happen to the town? Chad's brain was burning with worry. Downstairs, his wife and children were still up and about. So much had happened, they probably couldn't get settled down to rest. There was a slight sound. A rap at the door, perhaps. His wife walked around, and the floorboards creaked. He'd have to speak to the mayor about getting them replaced. But who could be out at this hour? There was absolutely no way he was going back to the control room. Someone came in. The door was still open. There was the sound of something falling over. Did the missus trip over that dang chair again? He wondered. Wait a minute. They didn't get back up. Footsteps crossed the living room and started up the stairs, creaking all the while. Must be his wife. Out in the hall now. Still coming. Slowly. Coming this way. The footsteps stopped. Out in front of the boys' room. Maybe I should go see who it is, he thought. No, it's just the little woman, of course. And besides, I'm dog-tired. The door opened. She shouldn't have gone and done that. Hey, that was a scream just now, wasn't it? More thuds as things fell. 2 of them. The door closed. The footsteps were coming closer. Slowly, no hurry. They stopped. In front of his bedroom. It couldn't be. There was a knock on his door. Chad remained in bed. The knocking continued, then stopped for a bit, and started again. Chad got out of bed. Step by step, each one feeling like it was sinking into the carpet, he headed for the door. He didn't want to go. He knew it was his wife outside the door, But what if it wasn't? Right in front of the door, Chad paused for a moment. The knocking stopped. The doorknob clicked as it turned, gently at first, then quickly. With a tremendous snap, the doorknob, the plate around it, and the section of door they were attached to all vanished. There was a gaping hole now, and the door had swung open. Someone was standing there. It wasn't his wife. A horrible choking sensation assailed Chad. He reached up to claw at his own throat, but before his hand got there, his heart had stopped. Page break indicated by a small cross. While it was indeed a hill, with a height of only about 15 feet, it hardly had a commanding view. And yet, for one of the two, it was surely more than adequate. After all, Lori wasn't alone, and by her side was a man the darkness suited more than anyone. Despite the moonlight, the plains they overlooked were as dark as anything imaginable, but the sky to the east was already laced with the first thin light of dawn. The wind pricked at Lori's cheeks. It was as cold and sharp as an owl. Lori gazed at Dee while Dee watched the eastern sky. Did those trapped in darkness hope for the light of dawn too? So, what did they come up here to do? Dee bent down by Lori's side and put one of the fingers of his left hand to the ground. Lori read the words he wrote in the sand. "I hear voices," Dee had written. What voices was he talking about? The message seemed almost cruel. Lori turned up the collar of her coat. The wind tossed her soft hair as it passed. So cold, she thought. Maybe people weren't meant to live out in the wild. After all, it was as cold even at daybreak. The town was still moving. But going where? It had no destination. Where was it heading? Not even Lori had any idea what Dee was thinking about. While it was true she'd been raised in town, she'd also experienced life out in the wilderness. The wilds were just too terrible. The fear inspired by the monstrosities and vicious beasts the nobility had loosed was still enough that the world would quake at dusk today. Lori had wanted to go back to the town with all her heart. However, the paradise she'd wanted now seemed so hollow. Lori no longer had words or sounds, which was exactly why she could feel things so much more intensely. She thought of working reasonable hours, and having reasonable accommodations, food and clothing, of having a life that was satisfactory, but not satisfying at the same time. The overwhelming sense of loss from the people after they'd made it through the magnetic storm only served to highlight her feelings. If she hadn't experienced life in the wilderness, she probably would have been just like the rest. Although she was far from conceited, Lori knew there was something wrong with the town as it was now. But, in her silent world of despair, did she have reason to be proud of being different from the rest? An inescapable sense of loneliness filled her little heart. While she had the feeling the world she was meant to live in was just around the next bend, for Lori that was a far distant land. If I get off this town, what'll happen next? She wondered. To the east, the edges of the mountains had begun to glitter with a rosy hue. Light slipped down the mountainside, becoming a torrent that flooded the plains, and in no time Lori's entire field of view was tinged in gold. She closed her eyes. Even with them closed, she could see. She saw the color of wind, and how the wind shined in its own way. After a while, Dee opened his mouth. Laurie tried to read his lips. She didn't catch it all. A bit more slowly, Dee repeated it. Finally, she understood him. Next time, come alone. And that's what he was saying. Page break indicated by a small cross. It was a little past 6 o'clock morning when Dee called on the mayor. He found the mayor sleeping in his chair in his office. As a cold pain tightened his chest, the mayor jumped up and saw the hunter standing by the door. Putting his hand to his throat and breathing a sigh, he asked, "How long have you been there?" Dee said nothing. "So, it seems I have you to thank for scaring the daylights out of me. Just having a damn beer around seems to be enough to give folks nightmares." "I'm here because I need to ask you something." "Ah, yes, that's right. You were by a little earlier, weren't you? You'll have to excuse me. I was out at the time." "It seems you had the knights detained." The hunter's softly spoken words made Mayor Ming's eyes bulge. "Who told you that?" "It doesn't matter. Why did you stop them? Why do you have them thrown in jail?" "Do I have to answer that? The only thing you're here to do is to kill our vampire." "And what if someone manufactured that vampire?" Dee asked. "What?" "What did the man who boarded your town 2 centuries ago have to say to you?" The mayor greeted the question with silence. What did it involve? More silence. And beads of sweat appeared on the mayor's brow. "Just what I told you before," the mayor finally said. His voice lacked strength of will, and Dee shouted it with his own soft tone. "What did the man who visited here 200 years ago tell you?" "I can imagine what it was, but I won't mention it. However, it was the knights who accomplished what your visitor hoped to do, but only after long years had passed. That's what you wanted. What did you want it for? Why did you have a falling out with the knights?" Nothing from the mayor. "After 2 centuries, vampires suddenly start showing up here, and yet we can't find the cause for it. There's no one here sucking people's blood and turning people into vampires. There's only one answer. They were manufactured. Made that way by somebody's special process." Dee's eyes looked like they could suck the soul from the mayor. "Made with the technique he gave to you, and you taught to the knights. What was in their house?" Bracing both hands on the head of his cane, the mayor hung his head. "Peace must be maintained in town for all time." A voice closer to a groan flowed from beneath the mayor's bowed head. "The conditions now are ideal, but we're still hounded by destruction and the creatures of nightmare. The mayor has a duty to protect the townsfolk." "Peace and ideals," Dee muttered. Coming from his lips, the words lost all meaning and became mere sounds. "This town is what the frontier would be ideally." Saying this, the mayor lifted his face. It was warped. His lustrous skin had surely been artificially augmented. The ugly wrinkles that crept across his cheeks looked like furrows in a freshly plowed field. to live serenely out in the untamed forces of nature without fear of the nobility or their despicable ilk. That was the human ideal. When I formed this town and peopled it with a select few, I believed I'd gotten closer to that goal than anyone. But many threats still remained. It was still far from perfect. The mayor's finger pressed the top of his desk. Suddenly, Dee was in the middle of town. It was the residential section immediately after the magnetic storm. The images must have been shot with a holographic camera. The plastic roofs of many houses were melted, and the electrical discharge towers gave off pale smoke and spat sparks in their death throes. People with burns either hobbled along on their own or were held up by family as they tottered slowly down the street, most likely headed to the hospital. A little girl passed right through Dee's waist and disappeared into a back room. A fire engine ran over a sofa and then plowed through someone's front door. Fires were springing up everywhere. A middle-aged man grabbed an electrified handrail, lurching backward as purple light shot from him. It was a ghastly tableau. This is the town at its limits. A mere magnetic field can't even begin to compare to the other monstrosities the nobility loosed on the world. Yet, if running into it wreaked this kind of havoc, then what the town considers ideal is still far shy of what I have in mind. And making those ideals a reality involves making sacrifices and taking certain steps, doesn't it? The hunter said. Certain bloody steps, I'd say. What exactly did you ask the knights to do? And the mayor swallowed loudly. He didn't suppose Dee was going to leave now, and he wasn't the kind to be taken in by a lie. As Ming was about to slowly take a step, his foot froze in place. An unearthly aura was filling the room. So this is what a Dhampir can do, he thought. This is the man called Dee. So terrified it wouldn't have been strange if his heart had stopped, too scared to even shake. The mayor gazed at the hunter's gorgeous countenance. Answer me. What did you ask the knights to do? What did they discover? It was... The mayor panted. An incredibly powerful essence threatened to crush his psyche. It was... At that very moment, the intercom on the mayor's desk flashed red. With a series of short, tension-filled buzzes, Dee's unearthly aura dissipated almost immediately. Wiping at his greasy sweat, the mayor grabbed the intercom microphone. What is it? This is the navigational control room. We've got a lone flying object approaching from northwest at a range of 40 miles. Speed is 60 miles per hour. The object is roughly the same size as our town. We're trying to hail it, but haven't gotten an answer. I see. I'll be right there. Don't forget to prepare for a counter-strike just in case. When he switched off the intercom, the mayor had a relieved look on his face. He felt more at ease having some unknown intruder threatening the town than he did sitting in the same room with the young hunter. Guess I'll be going then, the mayor said without looking in Dee's direction. Just then, the intercom buzzed loudly again. What now? The flying object has launched missiles. 3 in all. They're approaching now. 20 seconds to impact. Get the barrier up. It was damaged by the magnetic field. Repairs are still underway. and begin firing anti-ballistic missiles and anti-aircraft guns. When the mayor raised his now pale face once again, he saw no trace of D. Page break indicated by a small cross. The Grim Reaper was winging his way toward the town. A trio of long, thin Reapers actually, with sensors in their tips and flames gushing from the nozzles to their rear. Taking into account their own speed and that of the town, and they were constantly adjusting their course to the target as they closed in on it at full speed. Page break indicated by a small cross. At the sight of the hunter in black who had appeared without a sound, everyone in the energy output control room forgot their approaching death and stood in a daze. "Where's the barrier projector?" D asked softly. Even knowing that death was drawing ever nearer, he still managed to maintain his detached tone of voice. The eyes of all the workers focused on one corner in the back. D headed over to the silver cylinder. He was like a sprinting shadow. Saying not a word, the workers stepped to either side. In the gap they left was a gaping hole where a riot of pale blue electromagnetic waves danced chaotically. There was only one man who didn't leave his post. Welding gear in hand, his body unexpectedly flew backward into the room. Fire rose from the protective plates on his chest. He'd just taken a blast of electromagnetism. Silently, D stood between the man and the rough hole. His handsome face shone blue and cold. "Don't bother! Can't turn off the electromagnetic wave output," the man shouted as he used his hand to beat out the flames on his chest. "There's 100,000 volts running through there. Without a protector on, we're talking instant death." "Get in touch with the control room," D ordered the frozen workers. "When you need the barrier, I'll send the current through." Asking no questions and offering no arguments, the men nodded. One, who appeared to be in charge, brought his mouth over to the microphone on his shoulder and had them patch him through to the navigational control room. A slight tremor passed through the ship's hull. The anti-aircraft fire had started. While the town was equipped with anti-gravity generators and an electronic barrier, their armaments were incredibly primitive. Aside from the Prometheus cannon which, in a cruel trick of fate, had been stripped down for inspection an hour earlier, they had only 20 high-angle machine cannons, with a 2-inch bore and 30 anti-ballistic missile launchers. Of course, they couldn't be expected to produce their own shells and missiles, so those were procured from flying merchants who specialized in dealing with floating cities like theirs. Even so, such merchants were few and far between, meeting the town only 3 times a year. If they ran out of goods they couldn't produce in the interim, the floating city had no choice but to find them on their own. Many of the battles between 2 floating cities had resulted from this mutual need. But the hostile actions of the unidentified flying objects firing upon them were nothing short of indiscriminate slaughter. Prismatic flames spread across the sky, and black smoke enveloped the area. To increase their destructive power, the shells for the machine cannons contained depleted uranium, and were armed with proximity fuses. Even if they failed to score a direct hit, they would automatically detonate if their sensors detected a target within their destructive range. Each time the big guns fired, the whole town rocked wildly. The incoming missiles displayed the most astounding behavior. Like sentient beings, they dodged shells, and adjusted their speed as they rushed steadily closer. They seemed to be mocking the town. Minute course adjustments were nearly impossible for the town's anti-ballistic missiles. Every one that had been launched left an ineffectual trail of white through the empty sky as it disappeared. A small, black shadow of death clung to the town. People looked out their windows at the 3 points of approaching light. On every face was a despondent expression. The thought of the fate those missiles held for them robbed them of their willpower. Long spared the threats of the world below, the fragility of their peace had been made evident by their enemy's attack. Page break indicated by a small cross. "Missiles closing. 3 seconds to impact," came the blood-curdling news from the microphone on the man's shoulder. All eyes were on D. The hunter reached into the hole in the wall, and, grabbing a fistful of cables, he pulled down. From his shoulder to his wrist, pale blue electromagnetic waves clung to him like a spider's web, and white smoke rose from his body. His face didn't show the slightest hint of pain. His right hand went into action, pulling at the ends of the severed cords. Electromagnetic waves covered D entirely. Perhaps it was the first time this young man had worn a color other than black. Using his body as a conductor, energy suddenly shot from the reactor to the barrier projector. Richly colored blossoms opened near the town. Flames that could get as hot as 50 million degrees, and a lethal dose of electromagnetic waves and radiation churned through the atmosphere, threatening to destroy the electronic wall that had suddenly appeared. The people saw the electromagnetic waves running from D's right hand to his left in reverse direction. D's eyes narrowed. The flow changed back again. The barrier didn't fade until the trio of blasts dissipated in the air. First part, end.